Hello, and welcome to the next video in the Intro to Web Dev series. This video is going to talk about arrays, which let you store multiple values in a single variable. So just to get started, I have my regular setup where I have a Scratch directory full of some starter files, and I'm going to open them up in my browser in Atom here, and I'm going to open them up in my browser here. Okay, so let me just kind of organize that. And so I've got my code on the left and my sort of rendered content on the right. So right now the Scratch file doesn't do much. All it does is show a hard-coded hello world, and then in the load function, which is called onPageLoad, it prints something to the console. So I can open up my JavaScript console and see that it does indeed print the hello world message. Okay, so to kind of review some of the things that we've mentioned before. So by now, hopefully you are familiar with variables. So I can create a variable using the let keyword, and I give it a name. Let's say animal equals, and then a value. Let's say, I don't know, cat. And then I can use that that variable. So I can say like document oh my god, I can't spell, document write, and give it a string, like a p tag, saying something like my favorite animal is, and then I'll give it the variable and close it out with a closing p tag. So I'm using the string append operator to create a string that I will show in my web page. Okay, so I'm going to save that, and I'm going to go over to my browser and I'm going to refresh, and I see my favorite animal is cat. Maybe I'll make this just a little bigger. Go away. Whatever. My favorite animal is cat. So this is a variable, which hopefully you've seen before. We create a name and we give it a value, and then we can use that value wherever we want. Okay, so that makes sense if I have a single animal or a single variable or value. But what happens if I have multiple values? So let's say I went to the zoo and I saw a bunch of animals. So right now, using the concepts that we've learned so far, the only way we would know how to do that is to maybe create multiple variables. So I can say like animal 1 equals lions, maybe. Let animal 2 equals tigers. I really can't spell tonight. Let animal 3 equals lions, tigers, and let's say bears. And then I can use those variables exactly how I used my first one. So I'll say like document.write. Maybe I'll make a unordered list this time, and and I'll close it out. And then I'll have 3 kind of li tags inside of it. Document.write li plus animal 1 plus close my li tag. And so far I've only used one, but I've written a few lines of code, so I'm going to go over here and refresh. And okay, I see that I do indeed have animal 1 printed out. Maybe I'll add like document.write my zoo. See what that looks like. I could, make that a p tag. We'll see. I don't think I need to actually. Yeah, it looks fine. And then I'm going to do the same thing for the other 2 variables, basically. Animal 1, animal 2, animal 3. So I'm taking the variables that I've created, and I'm writing them to the page so that they are shown in the rendered HTML here. So let me refresh. And my zoo does indeed contain lions, tigers, and bears. Oh my. I really set myself up for that joke. Anyway, so now imagine, we grow our zoo, and now we have let animal 4 equals whatever, lizards. And I'd have to create that 4th variable and then use it down here. This is kind of a contrived example, but the concept is the same even for more complex examples where, you would have to make the change in a bunch of places, and it would just kind of get annoying and hard to deal with. So, adding animals becomes difficult. Subtracting animals, like, you know what, maybe I don't actually have tigers right now. Deleting it would be annoying, and it would just kind of not be fun to write code this way. So that's where arrays come in handy. So right now we have 4 variables that each point to a separate value. Instead, what I can do is create an array, which is a value, but the sort of magic is that an array contains other values. So what that looks like is I'm going to just have one variable. I'm going to call it like animals, and I'm going to set it equal to a value. And to create an array, you use the square brackets. So I'm going to type 2 square brackets, an opening square bracket and a closing square bracket, and then inside of the square brackets you can put your values in a comma separated list. So that's going to look like this, where I have lions, comma, tigers, comma, bears, comma, and what did I say before? Lizards. Sure. So this is our array, and notice it's a single variable that points to multiple values. It points to an array of values. In this case, 1, 2, 3, 4, 4 values. And so next, I have this variable, and now I can use the variable. So I'm going to change this code here. So instead of saying animal 1, 2, 3, 4, I'm going to say animals, and then I'm going to get a specific value from my array by using, again, the square brackets after the array name, and then in the square brackets I'm going to write an index, so a number. They start at 0, so lions is at index 0, tigers is at index 1, bears is at index 2, lizards is at index 3. The total size of the array is 4, so it's 0, 1, 2, 3. That's 4 values. Again, 0 indexing is kind of wonky, but after you see it a few thousand times, it becomes a little bit more natural. But anyway, I'm going to reference each individual value in the array by its index. So 0, 1, 2, 3. And I'm going to save that, and I'm going to refresh, and hopefully nothing has broken. And okay, cool. So we are doing the same thing with only a single value that contains or points to an array, which itself contains 4 values. And, that's better, I think. It's kind of debatable, I guess. But we're still doing this kind of, annoying, repeated pattern of animals, 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 animals. And if I add a value here, so I don't know, birds, I would have to change the code here as well. I'd have to add a line of code that that printed that extra value to my array. And that's still going to be annoying. That's still like a problem. But luckily, what you can do is remember our friend the for loop. You can write a for loop that does this. So this is repeated code that's doing pretty much the same thing, except the only thing that's changing is a number. And whenever you see that kind of a pattern, you should probably consider using a for loop. So what I'm going to do, instead of printing each individual value one at a time, I'm going to write a for loop. So I'm going to use the for keyword, and then in parentheses, I'm going to give it the 3 things that a for loop wants, and then I'm going to give it a body in curly brackets. So the 3 things that a for loop wants is, first it wants a variable. I'm going to call it index equals 0. And then it wants a conditional. So in this case, I'm going to say index is less than, and this is the expression, the Boolean expression that it's going to check. And if it's true, it's going to keep looping. So what I want to do is loop as long as index is within the sort of bounds of the array. So in this case, it's 1, 2, 3, 4. So I could say 4 here, but there's actually an easier way to do this. I can use animals.length, and so that will automatically contain the length of my array. So it's an easier way. I don't have to actually count it, and I don't have to know ahead of time how many animals I have. That'll give it to me automatically. And then the third thing that a for loop wants is the incrementer. And so I'm going to say index plus plus, increasing my index by 1 each time the loop kind of reaches the end of its current iteration. Okay, so I've got my for loop, and right now it doesn't actually do anything, but I can maybe steal this code, and instead of printing animals 0, what I'm going to do is print animals at index. And now here's the magic. I can delete all of this code. Deleting code is so satisfying. Okay, so assuming that I haven't messed up my syntax, what I have here is a for loop that is going to loop over the animals array, and for each value in the array, I am going to write a li tag that contains the animal at that index. And I'm going to close my tag. So I'm going to refresh this and see what happens. And cool, it's a little anticlimactic because nothing changes, but here we see that we are achieving the same effect with a for loop instead of manually writing a bunch of values to the page. And I'm using document.write just because it's kind of easy to demonstrate, but you know, this is also useful for any other kind of repeated action or repeated data. So, you know, we could be printing this to like a specific element using DOM manipulation or doing other stuff. But the idea is that this for loop iterates over all of the values in this array and then does something with that value. And you know, document.write is a little bit contrived, but the overall pattern is extremely useful. And the payoff here is now I can add as many animals as I want. So you know, if we were in person, I would just ask for people to call out a bunch of random animals, but whatever, fish, goats, what other animals are there? Why would I choose one that's hard to spell? Maybe there's a dragon or 3 in there. What else did I see at the zoo? I saw maybe some bison, maybe some cows, and so I've changed my array. Now my array has, I don't even know how many values, but the beauty, the magic of arrays and for loops is I don't need to care. I don't care how many things are in the array, because no matter what's in the array, I am doing the same thing. I am looping over it, and for each value in that array, I am, in this case, printing it to an li tag. So I'm going to save this, I'm going to refresh, and now my zoo contains all of those animals. And adding and removing animals is super easy now because I only have to change it in one place, and my code will kind of, you know, magically work because of the power of the for loop and the array. So that's arrays and for loops. Everything else that I'm going to talk about is kind of just an extension of that, but that's the fundamentals of it. You create an array using the kind of square bracket notation and then comma separated values, and then you generally will use a for loop to loop over the array and do something for each value in that array. This pattern is actually so common that there's kind of a newer syntax for it. I don't know, I like this syntax because it's really useful for other things as well. But if what you're doing is looping over an array, there's special magic syntax that you can use, and it looks like this: for, let, and then I create a variable, say animal, and I say of animals. And then I don't need to worry about dealing with the index at all. I can directly use this animal variable. So let animal of animals is, again, magic syntax that does the exact same thing as what we were doing before. It iterates over the array one at a time and lets you write code that does something for each value. So I'm going to go over here and refresh, and nothing should change. So it's kind of up to you which syntax you prefer. I kind of switch back and forth, honestly, but you can either use this for of syntax, or you can use this index syntax. Really what it comes down to is, do you need the index? And if not, then, you know, probably use for of. if you do use the index. So for example, if I do something like, print the value of the index maybe, and I don't know, this is a little bit goofy, but whatever. I'm going to refresh and see if I broke my syntax here. No, I didn't. Okay. So here, I'm using the syntax, or the index. So in this case, I would use this syntax. But if I wasn't, then I'd probably use for of. So again, just two different ways to do kind of the same thing. It kind of comes down to personal preference. So I would say use whichever one makes the most sense to you. Okay. So we've talked about arrays and for loops, and honestly, that's the fundamentals. I think that's kind of the new content. It's this new syntax and this new idea of using a for loop to repeat code. Next, I want to talk about the idea of other ways to get arrays. So here we created an array and we added some, hard-coded values to it. There are other ways to create arrays. So for example, let me change my code a little bit. Let's say hello world. I'm really bad at coming up with text on the fly. Let's go back to animals. So lions, tigers, bears. Okay. So I've got 3 p tags: lions, tigers, bears, and I'm going to get rid of all of this actually. Sure. So now my JavaScript only prints hello world to the console, doesn't do anything else. I'm back to something like this: lions, tigers, bears. Okay. P tag, p tag, p tag. What I want to show you is, so we've seen before the document.getElementById function, so I can do like id equals whatever, lions. This value can be anything, but I'm going to call it lions for now. So you've seen this before when we talked about DOM manipulation, where I can say let element equals document.getElementById, and then I give it an ID, lions, and then I can do something with it. Let's say element.style.border equals, I don't know, thick solid red. I don't know. Let's just see what happens. So I've got my p tag with an ID of lions, and what I'm going to do is write JavaScript that gets that element and then changes the style of it to have a red border. Okay. And that works. Cool. So you see that the JavaScript has modified this element on the fly using this document.getElementById function. Okay, so that's kind of a review of what we've seen before. Now, what I want to do is, what if I want to do that for every p tag on my page? How would I do that? And using the concepts that we've learned about so far, maybe what I would do is say id equals tigers here, and then I could come back to my JavaScript and I could write the very similar code that takes this and does something like this, where I say tigers, blah, blah, blah. But it has a similar problem to what we saw earlier, where it's just kind of annoying, and it's going to be hard if something changes over here. You have to go change it over in your script.js file, and it's just not a good way to live your life. But instead, what you can do is another function whose name I never remember. So what I'm going to do is go to a handy dandy search engine and go to like JavaScript. I think it's like document get elements by tag something, by tag name maybe. Yeah, get elements by tag name. So it's very similar to document.getElementById, and all I want to do is look at the name to remind myself, but if you want more information, read through W3 Schools and kind of do exactly what I just did, where I wasn't sure exactly what it was, so I searched for it and read more about it. Anyway, what I can do is call the document.getElements by tag name, and then I give it a tag. So tags are what we learned about way back when. HTML tags, things like p tag, h1, ul, li, a, img, image. Those are all tags, HTML tags. And the document.getElements by tag name function gives me an array of all of the elements that have that tag name. So in this case, that's these 3 p tags here. So I'm going to maybe rename my variable to like elements array just to make it a little bit easier to read. And now that I have this elements array, I can use a for loop, and I'm going to maybe use the shortcut syntax here, and I'm going to say let element of elements array. And then I'm going to give my for loop a body, and in that I'm going to move this code over there. So again, reading through the code kind of line by line, the load function first prints hello world to the console. That doesn't really matter for us. Then we call document.getElements by tag name, passing it the p parameter, which is going to get an array of all of the elements that have that tag name. So in our case, that's these 3 p tags here. And then there's a for loop that loops over each element in the elements array one at a time and sets the border field or variable, whatever you want to call it, on that element. So I'm going to refresh this, and we now see that all 3 p tags have that style. But I only had to type this line of code 1 time. I didn't have to type it 3 times because of the sort of magic of arrays and for loops. So if I add another p tag here, something like whatever, lizards, and I save that and I refresh, like I don't have to change my script file at all. I don't have to change my JavaScript at all because the array already contains whatever p tags are on the page. I don't have to manually go back and change my script tag. It'll automatically work because the array already contains everything. Okay, so that's one example of another way to get an array. Like notice that I didn't create the array myself. You don't see any square brackets here. It's all using this document.getElements by tag name. This is one example. I just wanted to show at least one example to introduce the concept of calling functions to get an array. There are many, many, many other ways to get an array or other functions to call that give you an array. So for example, one of them is very similar. So like, let's say I have classes. So maybe like class equals, what do I want to call this? Maybe these are the cats. So these are class equals cat. Bears are not cats. Lizards are not cats. So these 2 elements have the cat class. If I wanted to get those 2 elements, what I could do is call the document get elements by class name. Yeah, this one. So this is very similar to what we just saw, only instead of by tag name, it's by class name, and it takes the cat. So that's just another example of a function you could call. Another one that I want to mention that is kind of fun is string.split. So JavaScript string split, I'll search for. And again, I'm not going to spend a ton of time talking about every single way to get an array in JavaScript, but here's another one. You might read more about it. You might play with it and stuff, but this gives you an array from a string. So there's a way to split the words, split your string into individual words or individual characters, or other kinds of ways of splitting up your string. And this is really handy for things like text manipulation and things like data visualization and whatnot. Okay, so those are just some ways of getting arrays. Just know that there are ways to get arrays. You can create an array, or you can call a function that gives you an array, and it's all good. Okay, so I'm going to go back to maybe creating my array myself. So I'm going to have let animals equals an array, and in my zoo I'm going to have lions, tiger, oh my god, I really can't spell, tigers, bears, whatever, three animals, back to 3 animals. What I want to talk about next is, now that I have an array, I can also sort of mess with my array. I don't know how else I should say it, like modify my array. So for example, maybe I can just Control Z a bunch of times. Here, hold on one second. I want to go back to when I had my zoo being printed out. I should have maybe saved this, but whatever. This is maybe some behind the scenes. Okay, good enough. Okay, here we go. So now I'm back to the code that just prints a bunch of animals. Okay, so I've got my animals, and I am creating a list of them in the web page using JavaScript. Now, what I want to talk about is, now that I have an array, I can modify it. So one way to modify it is by adding stuff to it. So I can say animals.push, and this is a function that takes a parameter, which is another value. So I'm going to say lizards. I don't know why lizards are my go-to, whatever. So the animals array starts out as an array that contains 3 values, lions, tigers, and bears. Then I say animals.push lizards, which adds lizards to the array. And then the rest of the code is the same, where I use a for loop to loop over the array and print out all of the animals. So if we refresh here, you'll see that my array does indeed contain lizards. So this is a way to sort of grow the array over time. Maybe this is based on like user input. Maybe you're asking the user for, I don't know, their favorite animals, or really anything. You can modify an array and push new values to it. You can also remove values, and this is another thing that I always have to look up. So if I say like JavaScript remove value from array, and we will get a bunch of different options. I happen to know that what I'm looking for is called Splice. So maybe I will type array Splice. And again, I've said this probably a billion times now in these intro to web dev videos, but this habit of searching for things and then reading about them on MDN or W3 schools, like this is web development. So you can read more about how that works, but I'll run through it real quick over here. So I start with 3 values, and then I add a 4th value, and I say, you know what, I actually want to remove tigers from this list. So right now, tigers is here. I can call animals.splice, and splice takes 2 arguments, 2 parameters. The first one is an index. So in this case, what is it? 0, 1. It's going to be kind of a bad example because these numbers are going to end up being the same, but whatever. This is index 1. And then the second parameter is a count. So this is how many values do you want to remove? In this case, it's just 1. So again, goofy example because these ended up being the same, but maybe I'll show a different one in a second. So if we refresh this, tigers is no longer in my array. So even though it starts out in the array, I'm removing it here. So maybe I'll remove bears instead by changing the index. And again, indexes start at 0. So 0, 1, 2. So when I say remove the second index, remove 1 value starting at the second index, it's going to remove bears. So I'm going to refresh. And now we see that it contains lions, contains tigers, does not contain bears because we've removed bears, does contain lizards. So again, maybe just reading through line by line. First, I create an animals array, which contains 3 values. Then I push a 4th value to the array, and then I remove the value at the second index, which is at 0, 1, 2, which is bears. Okay, so that is a couple of examples of ways to modify the array after it's created. I've talked about adding values and removing values. There are other things you can do. Again, I don't think it's good for me to spend a bunch of time in these videos talking about every single option that you have, because really the idea is the same no matter what option you are going with. It's you create an array or you get an array, and then you call a function on that array that changes it. So from there, you can look up other functions that change the array. I'll just shout out that you can sort an array, which might be something that's interesting, but I'm not going to talk about it too much more. Okay, so the last thing I want to talk about is, like, what's the point? Kinda. don't know, maybe that's a dumb way to say it, but what is the payoff of all of this? What are these arrays and for loops used for? I have shown this example where we are printing out a bunch of animals, and that's all good. Maybe you can imagine that being useful for, I don't know, like say you were developing the web page of twitter.com and you had a bunch of tweets. You had an array of tweets and you wanted to show a big feed of tweets. It's probably something like a for loop, honestly, looping over an array of values. So what we've seen so far is kind of the point of arrays and for loops, but I want to maybe take it to the next level and talk about kind of, I don't know what to call it, like data processing or ways we might use for loops and arrays. So right now I'm printing out every single animal. Maybe what I want to do, well, first of all, let me maybe add a couple of animals like kangaroos, and maybe I'll add kinkajous. If you've never seen a kinkajou, I really recommend looking up images of what they look like. They are very cute. Look at that thing. Oh my god. Okay, so whatever. Now my zoo contains a few animals, and I can print all of them. That's all good, but maybe I want to run through the data and do something else. So right now I am just printing every single animal, but maybe I only want to print, let's say, the animals that start with K. I kind of planned that ahead. That's why I added those. I can do that by combining a few of the concepts that we've talked about in previous weeks. So we've talked about arrays, we've talked about for loops, and I'm going to bring back our friend, the if statement. So an if statement is the if keyword, followed by parentheses, and then some curly brackets, and then inside of the parentheses, I'm going to give it a condition. So in this case, I'm going to say, actually first what I'm going to do is, maybe I'll change this for loop to the other syntax. Nah, I'll do it this way. Let animal equals animals at index. Do I care about this? Actually, no. I'm not going to do it this way. Sorry, that was me debating with myself about how to write this code. Anyway, back to this if statement. In this if statement, I can write a conditional, and that's a Boolean value. And there's a bunch of different ways to get Booleans. I can use conditional operators like less than and greater than, or I can call a function that gives me a Boolean. So in this case, what I'm going to do is say animals I. So now I'm looking at the value that is at index, at index, and I'm going to call the starts with function, which is a string function in JavaScript that takes a single parameter, which is another string, and returns a Boolean. So again, if you didn't know that ahead of time, you could go search something like JavaScript, I really can't spell tonight. JavaScript check if string starts with whatever. And you will likely find it. JavaScript string starts with, and it's a function that takes a string and tells you whether another string starts with that string. So in this case, I am asking my code to tell me, does the value in my animals array at this index start with this letter? And if so, then I want to do something. In this case, maybe I'll just print it out. And I could do an else statement here, maybe I want to do something else with the animals that don't start with K, but for now maybe I'll just stick with just the if statement. No else if or else. So now I'm going to refresh it, and now my zoo contains only the animals that start with K. So this concept, again, I don't know how compelling this specific example is, but the idea is that the power of an array and a for loop is that it lets you do things like this, where you write code that looks at every single element in the array and then does something with that. That's being very broad and general, but that's kind of the point, right? You can do a lot of different things. Here, I am using an if statement to do something if the current animal starts with K, but really you can write really any code in here. Anyway, so that was just to demonstrate the idea of sort of data processing by looping over the data and doing stuff with it. I'll maybe just talk about one other thing, and that is just it's another extension of it. But let's say I wanted to, I don't know, calculate like what's the value in here that is the longest. And again, this example is kind of silly because we could probably just look at it and figure it out ourselves. But let's say I had 1,000 animals in my array. I wouldn't want to manually do that. I would want to write code that does it. Or, you know, what if we were getting input from the user? We don't know ahead of time what the user is going to say. So we want to write code that sort of calculates these things. So the way I can do that is, again, we're going to use a bunch of concepts that we've already seen before, just kind of combine them together, which is where code really starts to become really powerful. So I'm going to do something like, say, let longest word, and I'm going to set it equal to, at first what I'm going to do is set it equal to like the first element in the array. So I'm going to say animals 0. And maybe I'll change my for loop so that it starts at the index 1, which is actually the second value, because I'm assuming that the first value is the longest at first. So I don't actually have to check this at all. I'm going to start here. Otherwise my for loop is the same. And then I'm going to have an if statement that says like if, let's see, the value at animals index, if its length, and again, if you didn't know about the string length property, I could go to a search engine, type JavaScript string length, maybe that's cheating because that's, I happen to know what it's called. So like maybe I would say like JavaScript, how long is a string? And again, hopefully it returns the same kind of thing, string length, and you can learn all about it. I happen to know what it is ahead of time because I've used it a bunch of times, but the idea is the same no matter what. You're going to do some research and then use it. Okay, back to my if statement. If animals.index.length, if the length of the value at that index is greater than longest word.length, then I have found a new longest word, and I'm going to say longest word equals animals at index. And so now my for loop is no longer outputting anything directly. It is calculating a value that I can then use later. So now I can say like document.write, maybe here's my li, plus longest word, plus close my tag. Here, okay. And so now I expect when I refresh my page, what I'm going to see is whatever the longest animal name is. Refresh, and it seems that it is kangaroos. And I'm going to check that, and let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 versus, I think Kinkajuice is the only one. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Okay, so they're actually the same length, which is, that makes sense because of the way this comparison is working. When it gets here and it sees that Kinkajuice.length is 9, it compares that to kangaroos.length, which is also 9, and it says, hey, is this length greater than this length? It's not greater than, it's equal to, so it doesn't actually reset it. If I had another one, let's put it kind of somewhere in the middle just to kind of check it. I'm going to say like great white sharks, and that is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. It's a bunch of letters, so it's clearly the longest one. But I'm going to refresh just to check. And I broke something. Of course I did. Oh, here. I forgot a comma. So let me go back to refresh, and there we go. We have the longest value in the array. So, I don't want you to get too hung up on this specific example, but the reason I'm talking about this is this pattern is really powerful of using an array to hold some data or to get some data from somewhere else, like a user, or from something like the get elements by tag name function. No matter how you get the array, you have an array of multiple values, and then you use a for loop, and inside of that for loop, you can do stuff like either output every value or output the values kind of conditionally, which we saw before with starting with k, or in this case, you can write code that kind of does these calculations, and then you use those calculations later on. So those are very broadly some things that you can do using arrays, for loops, if statements, variables, kind of combinations of all of the above. Okay, so I think that's about as far as I want to go with for loops and arrays. The idea is that you have multiple values, you write a for loop that loops over the multiple values, and then you do something for each of those values. That something could be many different things, like outputting them all to the screen, or doing some calculation, or things we saw. And this is very powerful because this is used all of the time. Pretty much any time you have repeated data, you are going to be doing something like what we did here, where we have an array, we loop over it, and we do something in that loop. Again, I'm speaking very broadly because this is so useful that it's going to be impossible for me to like list every single way that you will ever use this pattern. But it's used all the time. So that was the point of it all. Okay, I think that's as far as I'm going to go with for loops and arrays. Thanks for watching. Have a lovely rest of your day, and I'll see you in the next one.